Refugee, there's a very clear definition of refugee in the Refugee Convention that was put forward in 1951 in the aftermath of World War II. So a refugee is someone who has a credible fear of persecution based on political affiliation, based on race and other criteria, as opposed to a migrant who is coming primarily for economic reasons. And I mean, one of the big debates or one of the big challenges often can be to figure out, well, is this person a refugee and therefore deserving of international protection under international law? Or is this person a migrant and we should obviously not oppress or reject migrants necessarily, but the fact is refugees have a particular legal status that's codified. And most of the countries in the world, including the United States, have signed the Refugee Convention. So it does make a difference whether someone from El Salvador is fleeing, say, political violence, which they were in the 80s, or is someone from El Salvador trying to come to the United States to just have a better life. And that distinction between refugees and migrants is something to keep in mind. But what I think is ironic, and this is something that you're probably aware of, but it can't be emphasized enough, the threat to Germany, or the threat to Norway, or the threat to the United States from refugee flow is never as great as the threat to neighboring countries. And I mean, the numbers are staggering. I mean, if you look at the Syria outflow, there are almost as many Syrians in Lebanon as there are Lebanese. There are half the population of Jordan now consists of Syrian refugees. And to me, there's such an irony in the way there's been fear-mongering around the refugee flow, I think especially in the United States. I mean, we're protected by the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and we have Canada to the north. So the only quote-unquote threat we have of uncontrolled movement into this country is from Mexico and from Central America. You know, Cubans and Haitians have come across the Caribbean, but just look at Jordan, look at Lebanon, look at Uganda with South Sudanese. I mean, the burden that these countries face, you know, on a per capita basis is unimaginable. I mean, it's literally the equivalent of tens of millions of refugees being in the United States. And the degree to which they accept people coming in, I think is really, really remarkable. We've seen very few examples of, to this day I don't understand why this French term was adopted, but the term for being forced back in the Refugee Convention is refoulement. And there are just very few examples, even by poor countries, of saying, no, you can't enter, or pushing people back. There's a degree of solidarity that I think is really remarkable. And you know, it's something that I wish could underpin our foreign policy a little bit more. The idea that, you know, a country like Jordan or Lebanon or Uganda needs special support as a result of the burden that they've been willing to take on. I don't like making security arguments about refugee assistance. I'm old school, I like to make the moral argument. But the fact of the matter is, if we want to limit the flow of refugees to Europe or limit the flow of refugees globally into wealthier countries, I mean, the way to do it is to have more effective policies in the countries that are impacted by conflict, whether it's diplomatic or whether it's providing more aid and so on. We can talk about that later if you have questions. Now on this, okay, so I've covered, refugees as opposed to migrants, then refugees as opposed to internally displaced people. Again, internally displaced people forced from their homes by conflict, but they do not cross an international border and therefore do not benefit from the protection of the Refugee Convention. So, and I think I've long campaigned on the issue of internal displacement and getting a more effective response, because I think you could argue that these people are even more vulnerable. Why? Because they remain in the country that is oppressing them and driving them from their homes and creating the conditions that force them to leave. So if you're an internally displaced person in Syria or an internally displaced person in South Sudan, you're on the run. Your life is inherently unstable, while leaving your country is in some ways, you know, it's gut-wrenching. You know, imagine any of yourselves feeling like life here in the United States is untenable. I really need to seek protection somewhere else. It's a very difficult decision to make. But nonetheless, when you cross an international border, you benefit from a legal regime. And there are organizations, starting with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but also, of course, Norwegian Refugee Council and others, that are set up to support you once you cross a border. And the challenging part for internally displaced people, again, is you're still in the midst of the conflict. You're still in the midst of the oppression that has driven you from your home, but you haven't been able to cross a border. And although our name is Norwegian Refugee Council, we work with both refugees and internally displaced people, and in some ways it's the work with the internally displaced that's the most challenging.